Aegon, a merchant from Syracuse, had a wife named Amelia, and they were deeply in love and joyful in each other's presence and life, until Aegon's manager passed on to the afterlife, and Aegon was forced to leave their home and go to Epidamnum. There, they had two children, twin boys that looked exactly alike to each other. In the same inn that the two twin boys were born, there was another couple, much poorer and worse off than Aegon and Amelia, who also birthed two twin boys, and they were so poor and destitute that they decided to sell their two sons to the richer couple as slaves. Aegon and Amelia accepted, and purchased the two boys before leaving on a ship back to Syracuse, where they were from. Unfortunately, the ship was damaged and started to leak, so the crew abandoned it, and their passengers were left for dead. They strapped themselves to the masts of the ship, and in this way they survived the sinking of the ship. But unfortunately, they were separated with one of their sons and one of the other children floating away with Amelia, and the same happening with Aegon. Amelia and the children were saved by the people of Epidamnum, but the children were stolen from her, and she was forced to return to Epidamnum alone and depressed, wallowing in despair. She later settled in a city called Ephesus. Aegon was more fortunate and made it back to their home in Syracuse with the children where he raised them until they were 18, though he lamented the loss of his wife and son. He named his son Antipholus of Syracuse, and the slave Dromio of Syracuse, which was quite the coincidence because the other set of children were given the same names elsewhere. At the age of 18, Antipholus of Syracuse was consumed with the desire to find his long-lost brother, and so he set off in search of him. When Antipholus of Syracuse left, Aegon could no longer stand to remain in his home, and so he left to travel as well for the next 5 years, before making his way to Ephesus. Unfortunately, the Duke of Syracuse was treating Ephesians so poorly that Aegon was arrested as soon as he arrived in Ephesus, and threatened with death unless he paid 1,000 pounds before the day was over. It turns out that the children that were taken from Amelia were actually citizens of Ephesus, and were called Antipholus of Ephesus and Dromio of Ephesus respectively. Even more coincidentally, Antipholus of Syracuse and his servant Dromio of Syracuse arrived in Ephesus on the same day that Aegon did, and escaped being placed under arrest by claiming to be from Epidamnum. Antipholus of Syracuse sent Dromio of Syracuse to place his money at the Centaur Inn, and stay there until Antipholus came to get him. 10 minutes later, Antipholus of Syracuse met Dromio of Ephesus and demanded to know why he wasn't at the Centaur Inn. Dromio of Ephesus had been looking for Antipholus of Ephesus at the behest of Antipholus of Ephesus's wife, and so delivered the message that Antipholus should return to a house called the Phoenix, and then ran away to avoid a beating. Antipholus of Syracuse did not heed Dromio of Ephesus, and instead returned to the Centaur Inn to check on his money. When he left the inn, he was approached by two sisters by the name of Adriana and Luciana. Adriana was Antipholus of Ephesus's wife, and she was convinced that Antipholus was running off with another woman, and chastised him for pretending not to know who she was. Antipholus of Syracuse was confused, but followed her when she demanded that he come back to the Phoenix to have dinner and explain himself. While Antipholus of Syracuse was inside eating dinner with Adriana and Luciana, Antipholus of Ephesus and Dromio of Ephesus were outside, attempting to gain entrance to their home, but were denied entry by Dromio of Syracuse. Antipholus of Ephesus was so irritated by the actions of his wife that he decided to give a golden chain that he had commissioned for her to another lady. Antipholus of Syracuse was quite taken with Luciana and attempted to woo her, though she instead reported his disloyalty to Adriana, who then spoke badly of him. Antipholus of Syracuse was then visited by Angelo the goldsmith, who had been commissioned by Antipholus of Ephesus to make the golden chain spoken of earlier. He gave the chain to Antipholus of Syracuse and then left. Later, Angelo had no money when he encountered a creditor, but was glad to see Antipholus of Ephesus stepping out of a nearby building. Unfortunately, Antipholus of Ephesus never received the chain, and so he refused to pay his debt. In response, Angelo told the creditors that he was lying, and the debt fell to Antipholus. Antipholus of Ephesus was then approached by Dromio of Syracuse and told that his goods were shipped successfully, and the winds looked good. Antipholus of Ephesus did not understand these words, so he ignored them and commanded Dromio of Syracuse to go find his wife Adriana and retrieve money to pay off the creditors so he wouldn't be arrested. Adriana was still upset about his betrayal, but still let Dromio of Syracuse take the money and retrieve her husband. On his way to Antipholus of Ephesus, Dromio of Syracuse encountered Antipholus of Syracuse and gave him the money, but Antipholus had not requested it, and so he did not understand. He was then approached by a lady asking for the golden chain that Antipholus of Ephesus had promised her the previous night. While this was going on, Antipholus of Ephesus was approached by Dromio of Ephesus with no money, and so Antipholus was enraged and began to beat him. The matter was not helped when Adriana and Luciana arrived, and all involved were convinced that he had gone mad. Adriana convinced the officers that he was unwell and to escort him to the Phoenix while she paid off the debt. Now that Angelo's debt was paid, he was friendly with the creditor and was discussing Antipholus's strange behavior outside of an abbey when they saw Antipholus of Syracuse walking around with the gold chain. The two confronted him about his behavior, and Antipholus of Syracuse drew his sword to defend himself. It was then that Adriana appeared and told those around that he was crazy and needed to be restrained. Hearing this, Antipholus of Syracuse and Dromio of Syracuse fled into the abbey to avoid being imprisoned. The abbess came out to see why everyone was gathered outside of her abbey, which is when Aegon arrived with the duke and the headsman to be executed for not paying the 1,000 pounds. Adriana begged the duke to exert his authority and make the abbess follow her entry into the abbey so that she could retrieve her mad husband, which is when a servant from the Phoenix arrived to tell her that her husband, Antipholus of Ephesus, was causing trouble at home. Then Antipholus of Ephesus arrived and told the duke that Adriana had been consorting with another man in his home. Aegon immediately recognized his son and attempted to prove it by showing himself to Antipholus of Ephesus. But Antipholus of Ephesus did not know his father. It was at this time that the abbess arrived with Antipholus of Syracuse and Dromio of Syracuse, and everyone expressed their confusion at there being two of Antipholus. The abbess then exclaimed that she would pay Aegon's debt to free him, and revealed that she was actually Amelia, his wife. Antipholus of Ephesus made up with his wife once the misunderstanding was settled, and Antipholus of Syracuse spoke to Luciana once again of his love for her, to which she responded with a look. The two Dromios were simply glad to not be receiving any more beatings